We can get started now. I am so happy to be joined by Mathangi Subramanian, who is the author of the book, A People's History of Heaven, which I just recently finished, and I was absolutely blown away by this. I've not gushed. I'm sorry, I should have gushed when you came on earlier. Like, this is
Thank you.
Such whenever I like to read books blind, so I didn't read anything other than the barest like first line of the description to know what book I was picking up, and I was surprised and pleased, and every step of the way of reading this book, it was really fantastic. To get started though, I'm just going to ask Mathu if she will read a couple paragraphs, 2 or 3 paragraphs from the book, just to give everyone who may not have read the book yet a sense of what they might expect in the pages.
Great. Well, thank you, Zach. Thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for joining me in my home from your homes tonight. So like Zach said, my name is Mathangi Subramanian, and my book, A People's History of Heaven, is the story of 5 girls and their families growing up in a slum in Bangalore that's about to be destroyed. And since the book is about stolen land, I always start my readings with a land acknowledgement. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm here in Denver, Colorado, on the ancestral unceded territory of the Cheyenne, Sioux, and Apache people, and that the Writers' Workshop in Bethesda, the Writers' Center, is on unceded ancestral Piscataway and Anacostan land. So keeping that in mind, I'm just going to read you a very short passage from the first chapter of the book called Breaking the Sky. The character who's the center of this kind of excerpt, her name is Deepa. She's 15 years old while this is happening, and the bulldozers have just rolled into the slum and are about to destroy the houses. And the most important thing to know about Deepa is that she can't see. She's legally blind. Once, when Deepa was watching Padma's brothers, an airplane cut a whirring path across the sky. Deepa couldn't see it, of course, but she could hear it roar. Wow, Padma's brother said, jumping up and down and pointing at the sky. Wow, 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 Akka, what's that thing called? An aeroplane, Deepa said, stumbling across the jagged vowels, the serrated consonants, the syllables sharp as shattered stones. It flies so high, Akka, the youngest boy said. Why doesn't it break the sky? Gee, what nonsense. You can't break the sky. But that aeroplane looks so pointy, the youngest said. Like a screwdriver, the oldest said, or a needle. If it did break the sky, I bet it would make a big sound, the youngest said, throwing his hands up in the air. I bet it would be an explosion. Don't be ridiculous. You can't break the sky, Deepa said again, more firmly this time. But really, she wasn't so sure. What would it sound like if you broke the sky? Would it be a jagged shattering of sharp-edged glass? A frayed ripping of overwashed fabric? Or would the sky break the way skin breaks, silently oozing and smelling like blood? This afternoon, when the bulldozers come, Deepa feels the air tremble, the clouds shudder. Hears the sounds of cooking pots and pressure cookers, light bulbs and radios, table fans and kerosene cans being thrashed into pieces, being beaten into the ground. Oh, she thinks. So this is what it sounds like. This is what it sounds like to break the sky. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just real quickly, who are you in a nutshell for our people?
So I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland. I went to Whitman High School. I'm not sure if there's any Vikings in the house, but go Vikings. And I lived in India for the past 6 years. We moved back in 2019. And I'm an educator by background. So I was a teacher and I have a doctorate in education, and I still work for Sesame Street. I worked for the City Council of New York. So I had a whole bunch of different jobs. And one of them was actually, I got a Fulbright to go to Bangalore. So my husband and I moved to Bangalore in 2012, and I spent 2.5 or 3 years doing ethnographic research in Bangalore slums. And I wrote, the academic papers I was supposed to write. And then I ended up also writing this novel based on that research, and also another novel that's for young adults. And now we live in Denver, and I work from home, and I'm a writer, and I also have a 4-year-old who we adopted when living in India. So writing is like the most important thing to me, but it's like I have my paid work and then I take care of our kid and then writing comes next. So it's sort of like my thing that I fit in between the cracks of everything else. So it takes me a while to write a book, but it is, I mean, I've been writing since I was 5, and it's the way that I process the world and cope with things. So.
I mean, I hope you will not take offense at this, but it's kind of obnoxious that you write this well as like the 3rd thing on your list.
Oh,
like you're saying.
Well, when I was writing that, it was the first thing on my list.
Okay.
So the next book will take much longer than this book.
No, because it is a stunningly written book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So the first thing and there's a link to purchase it from eCity Bookshop up on the chat window right now. So the first thing I mentioned in the questions I sent to you earlier, and I've actually amended this first note, the point of view of this novel is like in the questions in the back of the paperback, they actually mentioned the point of view as first person plural, which means it's narrated by a collective we, which is a relatively unusual. You come across it once in a while, but it's not a common one. But I'm reading this as slightly beyond that too. So I believe it's a limited omniscient first person plural, because occasionally the we voice is able to know things that the girls who are living in heaven wouldn't have access to or wouldn't know, when you're experiencing things beyond the experience of the we. So you have this point of view that I had to make up a term for because I don't know that I've encountered it before. So where did this point of view come from?
So as I was writing the book, so the way the book kind of happened is I was doing research in preschools in Bangalore. They're called Anganwadis, in Bangalore and across India. And I was there to do education research, but I didn't realize that these preschools were also the only spaces in India where poor women could gather freely and in public. And so suddenly I was surrounded not just by the voices of preschoolers and their teachers, as I expected, but also all the women who kind of dropped in during the day. So everyone from like the 12-year-old who ran away from home to the 80-year-old widow who had lived in the slum since it was founded, to like the young 19-year-old pregnant first-time mother. So they were all coming in and out and talking, and I speak Tamil, which isn't the main language in Bangalore, but I could get by with it. And then I learned Kannada while I was there. So I was able to converse with people. So all of these voices sort of filled up my head, and that's where the characters came from. And one thing I noticed about all of these women is just the ways that they took care of each other and the ways that they were just sort of unconditionally there for each other. So the voice kind of started out to me as the voice of the 5 girls who are the main characters in the book and who you sort of see grow up over time. Because I just remember my female friendships being so close at that age. You know, like we all liked the same things, and we all thought the same way, and we all felt like the same person. So that was kind of the genesis of the voice, and then it sort of grew to include more and more women in the community, because there was just this sort of sense of everybody taking care of each other and everybody sort of looking out for each other. And that kind of collective is something that I had grown up with, but hadn't really like noticed or observed or seen until I was doing this research.
So how much of this point of view was there from the start? Like in your head as you started writing, how much emerged as you were writing, how much emerged as you were revising after you had a draft or in later drafts of this book?
So this actually has never happened to me before, because every book I've written, I've had to start over with several different voices until I found the right one. But this one actually started out as a very strong kind of we voice. I did try and transition it a couple of times just because I thought that for like the worst reason, which if any of you are writers, you know this, if any of you are trying to be writers, then hear this. Like thinking about what publishing would want and what they wouldn't want. I thought they would never want like a brown woman's book with a collected first person, because already it's just so hard to break into publishing and to take risks like that on your first book. But I did, and it worked, and I kept switching it in and out, but that was the voice that just felt the most real. And like I said, that's never happened to me before. Usually the first voice I choose, I have to like go back and try a few things before.
Was there anything unique about the revision process for this book? I mean, I feel like how did you find yourself drifting out of that? Did you find how did that revision process? It seems like it would be slightly different from a more familiar point of view.
Yeah, so the revision process was actually pretty crazy because the book started out actually as a bunch of linked short stories. And so that's how I shopped it. And that's how I found an agent, was actually through these linked short stories. And also several of the stories in the book were published or won prizes, which is why I sort of realized this is a manuscript that has legs. And then it got sold to Algonquin, which is my amazing press, and my editor, who's really great, was like, you know, this feels more like a novel because the voice is so consistent and it's the same characters inhabiting the same world. But I think you need some kind of through line. So that's where the through line. So initially, the demolition was like a separate kind of story, and initially, well, I won't give away the ending, but there was a different ending than what is in the final book. And so I ended up having to go back and rewrite that as more of a through line and kind of string the stories along with it. But so the point of view wasn't as much of an issue as trying to figure out the chronology and trying to figure out how the stories fit together, and also to cut certain places that weren't fitting with sort of the new timeline. But the demolition was always in the back of my mind, especially because when we first moved to Bangalore, there was actually a slum nearby that was demolished. And in the book, there's the kind of demolition thread. There's a photographer who shows up who's like a foreign photographer who comes and takes pictures, and the girls kind of use the photographer to control their fate. And when we were in Bangalore, there was a slum that was destroyed, and it got a lot of attention because a German photographer went and took pictures of the demolition and ended up starting a lot of activism among sort of upper caste communities like the one that I belong to. But while I was there, some of the women who I was working with saw the pictures and they were like, this is not what our life looks like, right? Which, I mean, to be fair, this photographer was trying to get people to feel sympathy for a community that had been destroyed, so the pictures were very bleak. But, and I saw these pictures displayed in a gallery called Thalam, which one of my friends owned, coincidentally. So I actually worked with some of the women and a professional photographer to take photos of the slums through their eyes, and they took a completely different set of shots, and they got to actually show their photos at Thalam, the same place where I first encountered the demolition and this German photographer. So it was kind of a really beautiful way to kind of be in dialogue with foreign photographers and Indian photographers in these spaces that are known almost purely as places of like suffering and poverty. So that storyline that eventually went through the book as part of the revision process was very much inspired both by seeing those photographs and also being part of a photography project myself.
Just a real quick reminder to everyone that if you have questions along the way, if you type your questions into the chat window, I'll keep an eye on the chat window myself and ask the questions as they pop up, or maybe a little bit later, but please put your questions there and we will get to them, hopefully all before the end of our chat. So your answer is just then have me like wanting to ask like 12 questions. So I'm gonna just go. But the last that you just spoke about, the disconnect between what the photographer, and there is a photographer character in the novel, obviously now I'm understanding where that character came from.
Yeah.
But I was interested in how perception of a slum sort of is at odds with the tone and the language used by this collective we narrator that we have. And I'm always interested in how you have this, there are certain expectations of the setting, and then the richness of the lives of the characters and the tone of the book are almost at odds with the expectations of someone coming in to the setting. So how did tone and language interact with the setting and with the expectations maybe of the setting even more than the setting itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I recently saw, I guess it wasn't recently because the pandemic makes it feel like it was recently, but it was or a century ago. I don't know. I don't even know what time is anymore. But when Ocean Vuong, who wrote On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, he was interviewed on Seth Meyers, and he was talking about how he wanted to write these sort of poor Vietnamese families in Connecticut, and to prove that their bodies and their homes were worthy of literature. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, I didn't know that was actually something that was very much on my mind when I was writing this book. I think so many depictions of slums, whether they're in India or in Greater South Asia or in the Global South, are just these places that are just full of despair and poverty and where there's just nothing joyful there. But the fact is that, humans live in slums, and humans have complicated lives. They have, they have complicated emotions, and nobody is sad all the time, and nobody is happy all the time. So what I really was trying to do with the language was, there's a line in the book that talks about, or there's a paragraph that talks about how nobody writes poems about AC bus red or pavement gray. They only write poems about country colors. And when I was doing this ethnography, there were so many issues in the slums and so many inequalities, so many social justice issues. But there was also just so much like persistence and survival and so many moments of beauty. I mean, kids were still being born. You know what I mean? People were still falling in love. Like, people were still graduating from college. Like, there were all of these victories that I don't think, whether it's a Western author or whether it's I think many Indian authors are guilty of this as well. And I think there are several books that are out now that do this as well, that sort of don't consider these bodies worthy of literature. And by that I mean, they're not worthy of beauty. They're not worthy of nuance. They're not worthy of a wide range of emotions and experiences. And I really just wanted to avoid that, because I just saw, I was also a little ashamed because I was surprised by this, right? Like, I'm from India, and I was like, wow, there's just like all this life here. And I was like, well, why wouldn't there be life here? I mean, these are people just like me. Like, if I hadn't been born, 3 blocks away or whatever, or, well, I was born in another country, but if my mom hadn't been born 3 blocks away in like the fancy hospital, this is the life I would have had, right? So I really wanted to use the language to kind of elevate the setting and the people, and to show that their lives are just as complex as people who speak English, as people who have money, as people who live in proper housing.
Experience any pressures along the way in terms of publishing? Because there are expectations in publishing too, and I think maybe, their author is missing the point sometimes too, but I also believe there's publishing pushes for certain things. I know that next Wednesday we're talking with the author Tope Falarin, and I talked to him when his first paperback release, and I talked to him when his hardback came out around this time last year.
Yeah.
He mentioned the fact that his agent had actually guaranteed him some ridiculous advance if he was willing to change the story to focus on the father character and make it a traditional immigrant story of an African immigrant coming to America. And because that was marketable, but that's not the book you wanted to write. So I'm wondering if you've experienced any of the same pressures to twist this into a shape you weren't as comfortable with.
Yeah, I actually met Tope at a literature festival, and we actually talked about this. I was very, very lucky. So I just lucked out every step of the way. Like, my manuscript was pulled off the slush pile of the agent that I ended up going with, which never happens, right? My reader my agent's assistant was a really great reader and didn't insist on anything out of control. And then at Algonquin, an intern who was from Bangalore read my manuscript and recommended it. So all along the way, I sort of had people protecting me. So I never felt any pressure to change what I was doing. And even Algonquin was so amazing when the paperback came out. They were sending me all these covers that had Rajasthani brides and people from Pakistan, people who weren't from South India, and I was like, any Indian is going to see this and realize that this is really messed up. And all these brides were covered in gold and wearing North Indian, whatever. And I said to the press, my friend is a photographer, the one who owns this gallery I was talking about, he's a photographer, he can just take some pictures for you. So he took pictures that ended up on my paperback cover of my friends in Bangalore, in one of the places that's in the book. And I just felt like I just got so lucky all along the way. I will say, when I was deciding on agents, there were several, including someone who is a person of color, and I hoped would know better, who asked me to make the book more palatable to an American audience by reducing the number of characters, by having the slum be destroyed in the end, by changing the point of view. But I was lucky enough to find an agent who had faith in the book and didn't ask me to do any of those things. So I think because I ended up with that person, I ended up protected from a lot of these things. But I mean, I will say that I've written a YA book that takes place in India and is based loosely on the story of my daughter's adoption, that nobody would take here. So like my agent tried to sell it to, I think 20, 25 publishers here. And many of them said the characters were not relatable. Many of them said the setting was not relatable. And I was like, there are 1 billion Indians in this world who relate to this book. So I'm not really sure what you mean by unrelatable. So though I haven't experienced it with this book, I've definitely experienced it kind of outside the peripheries of it.
Can I just throw, as a marketing person too, like every time I hear someone speak of what is marketable or sellable,
Yeah.
they are talking from the butthole. They almost never have any understanding. What is marketable and sellable? I think there is, okay, yes, there are things I cannot in fact market, but the things, these categories are so arbitrary, and it's, look at Hollywood movies as a great example, is they want something that looks a certain way because they know it will do well enough to justify the effort. But I don't know. I can't go down that hole.
No, and it's like, I've been reading books about white people my whole life and relating to them. Like, I don't see why they can't relate to me if I read a book, right? And also, like, South Asians are the largest English readership in the world. So to say that something that is about South Asia is unmarketable is just like again, there are 1 billion of us just in India. And there's also Pakistan and Bangladesh and Nepal and Sri Lanka. Like, there are plenty of people who are interested in stories about the subcontinent and who speak English and who have disposable income, you know? So, but anyway, I'm like letting my frustrations getting into this. It's supposed to be a crafts chat, not
No, I think we can just, we can be mad back and forth now for a while.
Okay. Sounds good.
That's what this is from now. So I have a couple
great.
questions coming in from the chat. So, and this was similar to some questions I had, so maybe I'll follow up with those after asking this one, which is, what was the hardest thing about converting short stories into a novel? The mediums are very different for me.
Yeah, I mean, everything. It was really hard. I think probably the hardest thing was the structure. So, you know, short stories are kind of linked, and I felt like the short stories were telling a story, but to try and put them in the right order, especially, so I ended up putting them kind of in chronological order, but then, so the way the book is structured is sort of like, there's like this through line of the slum that's going to be destroyed, and everybody's trying to stop the demolition from happening, all the girls are, and their moms and grandmas. And then each girl gets sort of a like story in elementary school and then a story as she gets older. Just loosely, that's the structure. So the short stories, it made sense because it was just like everybody growing up and different grades and things like that. But then once I had to put it in around the demolition, I sort of had to make the demolition through line make sense with the story, so you didn't feel like you were jumping between things, and also to have the reader be able to keep track of all the different storylines that were happening. So that was probably the most difficult thing. In terms of point of view or, you know, on the sentence level or anything, none of that was as hard as figuring out the order.
So, I mean, there are so many characters in this, and you mentioned that being a hard point in terms of selling the book to at least certain agents who were very wrong. And with that said, just on a craft perspective, how did you go about juggling that many characters? That seems like that's a task unto itself. I mean, as a writer, I would never attempt to write that many characters novel just because my brain would not keep them in order. So were there any, how did you deal with that? Was there any particular techniques you used? Did you have a spreadsheet somewhere to practical things to more abstract things?
Well, so I think it was sort of the way that the characters grew was very organic. And so I didn't have a hard time keeping track of them because there were always sort of the there were 7 main girls, and then 2 of them ended up one got cut completely, and then one became Leela, who was, who Rukhsana, this is not a big spoiler, but Rukhsana falls in love with this girl. One of the characters falls in love with this girl in one of the chapters. But I thought of it sort of in terms of families. So every girl had like a mother, and most of them didn't have fathers, but they had some backstory with the fathers and family. And many of the characters only show up in like one chapter and in one telling. And so I think that made it easy to kind of keep track. Yeah, I don't know. I think because I started with the girls and the world kind of grew from the girls, it was easy to keep track. I think if it had been a novel, it would have been harder, but because it started as short stories that felt very contained, it was easy to keep track of them. But I cut so many characters. Even before it went to my agent, I was like, this is a lot for anybody. And then the other thing I did which I still have mixed feelings about, is I changed a lot of the names. We have very long names in South India. My name is Mahagi Subramanian, so you get the idea. So I changed a lot of the names to be shorter. There's a Geeta auntie who had a much longer name. Rukshana had a longer name. So a lot of them I just sort of shortened to be ones that I thought that like Western audiences would be able to remember and keep in their head.
Which is your favorite character?
Everyone asks me, I don't have a favorite character, man. It's like asking me which is my favorite kid.
I don't have kids, but I would totally have a favorite kid.
I only have one kid, so
So it's easy.
so she's my favorite. So that's an easy question to answer. Yeah, I don't have a favorite. I'll tell you that the ones that I probably related to the most. So Neelima, who is Deepa's mother, she goes through pregnancy loss, which is something that I've been through. And she has a lot of experiences that are very similar to mine. So she's probably the most similar to me. And then Joy's character, I feel attached to in a different way because Joy is trans. And again, this is not a spoiler. This is like on the back of the book. She's trans. So I did so much research for her character. I read so many books. I talked to so many trans people. I went and I hung out at this intersection where there were, so in India, they're called hijras. So they're not really trans, they're like a third gender basically. And I made friends with them and, talked to them because I was just so, I just wanted to be so careful about writing this character. I had beta readers. I never got any trans beta readers, but I got a couple of non-binary beta readers to help me out. So because she took so much and just like figuring out, and I still get criticized for this, but figuring out when to change Joy's pronoun and when to use. So some people now say that I should have, like Joy's pronoun changes throughout the course of the book. In just one story where she transitions, it changes. And so I got the advice to start as he and then change to she, and then there are people now who say it just should have been she the whole time. So I mean, I'm cis, so I'm gonna make mistakes like that. But I do feel a special attachment to Joy just because I spent so much time trying to get her right.
Rukshana might be my favorite, just going there with.
A lot of people like Rukshana, I have to say.
She's the rough edge character, but then also has a nice depth and coming of age kind of, anyway, it's good.
Yeah.
Oh, more questions from the chat. So how do you know when a novel is done? Any advice on making the best first impression when sending query letters to agents and getting them to want to read your manuscript?
Okay, so how to know when a novel is done? I have to be honest, when I turned this in, I still wasn't convinced it was done. So ask me with my next novel. But I think it's and Zach, I mean, I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but it's a leap of faith in some ways. There's always more you can do. And I actually, I'm so insecure, and I think many writers are, but what a minute, so I'm just gonna admit it out here, that there are only certain passages I can read at readings, because if I read other passages, I'm like editing in my head all the things that I would do differently in a new draft. So I don't know. I mean, I think at some point you just have to decide that it's done.
Yeah, I think that in my reading copy, there's actually like some post-it notes over sections I don't want to read because I would have edited them out. So before I went and did that, I practiced my reading. I spent a month almost every night reading the main portions I was going to read at events out loud. And doing that, if you read something out loud that much, you're going to find changes. For me, it really was relatively small because I read out loud a lot and I'm a pretty good editor, but there was one section like, why is that whole paragraph, why does that exist? Didn't need to be there. So I literally just covered it up so I wouldn't read it accidentally. So it's never done. I mean, I think that there are novelists I know who have that ability to sit with the book I'm that way with short stories usually. Like I get short stories as close as I can to being done. But and I know authors who have that ability with novels, but I will never be one of them.
I wonder if it's something that you grow into also. Because I mean, I also this book, I turned it in 3.5 years ago, right? And it came out a year ago. And I've grown and my writing has grown and my understanding of humans has grown. So obviously this thing I wrote is going to look differently to me now than it did then, you know?
I always hope that I will look back at old things and know ways to improve them, because that means I am improving as a writer continuously.
Yeah,
So it's
totally.
not a bad thing. You're never going to publish a perfect thing. So you have
Right.
to publish it as good as it can be in the moment. And
Yeah.
it's a good thing if you look back and recognize there's the ways you could improve, because that means from like, and you try, the manuscript's a year old by the time it gets published. So hopefully in that year you've read
Yeah.
more, you've written more, and you've learned something. So I don't think it's a
Yeah.
bad thing to have. I don't have regrets about the things that are in that book that I would change. There's no
Yeah.
regret there, just an acknowledgement of, yeah, I probably wouldn't do that now.
So maybe that's the answer. Like, I don't have any regrets about anything, but there's definitely things that I would rewrite now in a very different way. But then the other thing is this is an artifact of me at, you know, whatever age I was when I finished it. And this is who I was and this is what I wrote. And now then my next book will be who I am when I'm, you know, whatever age I am when it comes out. And yeah. So in terms of query letters, okay, this is hard. So I think the biggest mistake that I hear, so also I'm not an agent or an editor, but just from talking to beginning authors, like one thing I think that people do in query letters is they try and do too much. Like your query letter is supposed to be a page, and your query letter, there is a formula and you just follow it. So it's like you say, hey, agent, editor, this is why I think you're interesting. These are the books that I read by you. You're awesome. Here's my book, bam, 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 in like 4 sentences. Here are the comp titles. And comp titles are books that that have come out and that have done well commercially. So the way that editors basically, or that houses look at comp titles is they say, okay, well, the book is like this book, and this book sold this many millions and zillions of copies. So maybe we'll actually, you know, sell millions and zillions of the book, you know, this book in the query. So I think my agent, in my letter, I think I compared mine to Slumdog Millionaire, which is like awful because I have so many problems with that movie and that book, but it got me in the door. And I think I also compared it to Jacqueline Woodson's book. What is her Brooklyn? Why am I blanking on this? It was my comp title. Okay, I'm gonna Google it as I'm talking to you guys. So that had come out, and I included that because it was another Brooklyn. Sorry, I can't believe I forgot this, one of my favorite books. Another Brooklyn had just come out, and it was doing really well and winning a lot of awards, and so I used that as my comp. So again, so it's like the agent, why you want them, like 4 or 5 sentences about your book and the comp titles, a bio that makes you look as accomplished as you possibly can, just like throw every single thing you've done in, and then a line being like, I look forward to, you know, hearing from you. And that's it. And then I think it's also really important to read what every agent wants, because some agents want the first 10 pages, some agents don't want any pages, some agents want 50 pages. And I think a lot of people don't, like agents pay attention to whether you read what they asked for or not. So I think that's important too. And I think it's really important to do your homework on the agent and be able to say what books of theirs you've read so that they know that you fit into what they're agenting, right? So if I had queried somebody who did science fiction, they'd be like, why are you bothering me? Like, I don't represent books like yours. Whereas the agents that I queried, they represent literary fiction, they represent family sagas, they represent writers of color who write outside of the United States, right? So also I think in the process, like identifying who's gonna be a good fit for you. And the way I found my agent is that I just read a bunch of books that I loved, and then I looked through the acknowledgments and I saw anybody who mentioned an agent, I just like wrote it down. And my agent had agented a couple books that I really loved. And she was the one who said yes, so she became my agent. So Zach, do you have an agent? You do,
Yes,
right?
I do.
Yeah.
I mean, it took 2 novels and 4 years of querying. So there's also, it's agents receive ungodly numbers of query. Think thousands a year, so 10 queries a day. So first of all, in all publishing, rejection isn't necessarily a statement about the quality of the work. It's just a statement about the math. So, you know, it can be about the quality of the work, but if you are developing as a writer and have confidence in what you've written, then just know that I've known so many writers get disheartened after they've queried 10 agents and don't hear a response. Like that's the first day of querying.
Yeah.
you know, that should be day one, and then there should be another. You should never query one agent. You should query 20, just because it's such a slow process. No is the normal answer, and not because of the quality of the work. And it's a time suck. It absolutely is a time suck, because the research you mentioned, you have to do that research. You never want to like be a waste of a time for an agent. If they only rep science fiction, don't send them your non-science fiction book, or vice versa. If they don't rep sci-fi and you have a sci-fi novel, you can't submit to them. And they get awful queries constantly. So the first thing to do is know what a query letter looks like, and it's a very generic format. Once you write one, you'll maybe change a sentence at most, query to query. There were, I think with my agent, I don't think I probably changed. I think I just sent my generic one too, because my book description described the book in such a way that showed that when she made that sentence, she recognized that I was at least someone who understood what she was looking for. And so, yeah.
This was my third. I started querying agents when I was 25. So this was like the third time, a third different manuscript, maybe fourth actually. Can't remember if it was the third or fourth, but like I started querying in 2005 and I got my agent in 2015. So like it was like several rounds, several books, several tries. So it takes a while. And then you know, once they respond to your query, they're like, okay, give me 50 pages. And I read 50 pages. Okay, give me the whole manuscript. And they're like, okay, let's do a phone call. Let's do another phone call. So even after you get a bite, it's just.
I just sent pages of the next book to my agent. I'm like, are you still going to be my agent? Do you like the 30 pages of this next thing? Or
I know, I can't. I feel like after she couldn't sell my last book, I have to send her a finished book. Like, I'm not sending my agent any partials anymore because I'm so embarrassed that she couldn't sell my last book. So it never ends, basically.
All right. So can you please share your daily routine and writing schedule?
Yes, but I'm sorry. I'm just going to tell you ahead of time, it will be disappointing, just so you know. So, okay, during pandemic times, so as I mentioned, I have a 4-year-old, and I am the childcare. So my daily routine right now is, but my mom is living with us now. So she watches my daughter for like 3 hours a day. And my husband does mornings and evenings. So my daily routine is I wake up and do like a bunch of self-care, like meditation, exercise, stuff like that. And then I take my daughter at 8. I take her for a walk. I homeschool her. I take care of her until 11. And then from like 11 to 2 every day, I'm doing my consulting work. I'm lucky if 2 to 3 I get to write. And then take care of her again until 5. And then I write like maybe 5 to 6. But I've always been someone who had to fit my writing into like the rest of my life. So this book I actually wrote, I had a full-time job. And so every Sunday, this is pre-child, every Sunday from like 10 to 2, I would go to our local coffee shop in Delhi and I would write for 5 hours every Sunday. And I did that for 2 years. And then I had the first draft and then another year to revise it. And then I quit my job. And so I quit my job because I hated it. And I was going to look for, this is in Delhi, I was going to look for another one. My agent sent me edits. I edited like crazy for 3 weeks. And then I got a message from the Indian government that I was matched, my husband and I were matched with a child. So then I went to Jharkhand and Ranchi and I adopted my child. I came home and tried to raise my child. So basically since then, writing has just been sort of like tucked into the corners of things. I think if you're a parent, I think if you're a mom, I think if you're somebody who is writing from a marginalized viewpoint, you just have to keep pressing through and you just have to have faith in yourself that you're going to get it done. And I also, especially at the beginning of this pandemic, I sort of was putting a lot of pressure on myself to finish and to write every single day and to have every single day be productive. And I finally just got to the point where I was like, okay, so what's the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is that I never write another book. Would my life be okay if I never wrote another book? And I was like, yeah, my life would be fine if I never wrote another book. And then suddenly it was easier to work on the book because it felt like less pressure. Like it's just going to get done when it gets done. You know what I mean? I mean, Akwaeke Emezi is this amazing writer, and her book, their book, The Death of Vivek Oji, just came out this year, and they put out like a book a year every year. And I was like, why can't I do that? Well, I have a child and I have a job and I have all of these other things. So I think you just have to kind of give yourself grace, and not every day is going to be a productive writing day. Like some of us aren't going to put out books every year. That's just not the way we work. So yeah, sorry. Clearly this is something that has been like eating me alive during the pandemic. So that was a very emotional and long response, but that's my routine, if you can even call it that. And I will say one last thing and then I'll stop. I think especially now, we have so little control over our time and sort of our mental health. It's like every day I open the news and I'm like, okay, is today going to be a writing day, or is today going to be a day where I scream on the phone to my elected officials, or is today going to be a day where I like sit in the corner and cry about like the way the world is burning? So, I think that unless you have a lot of space and time, it's really difficult to be creative. And I think that there's lots of ways to be creative. And if you can't write right now, at least this is what I tell myself, it's okay. There will be time to write at some point.
I think you covered the last question that just popped up in the chat. You ended up going all the way through that one too. So, and I'll say, I can't remember which National Book Award winner it was, but I was a young writer and I was at a talk by a National Book Award winner, and she said, someone asked like, do you write every day? And she sort of laughed and said, sometimes like 2 weeks go by and I won't be able to put a word in a page. And that was such a freeing thing to know that someone who succeeded at the highest level of literature doesn't sit in front of the computer every day.
Sorry, I was going to say Toni Morrison, who, we just celebrate, I don't know if you say celebrate, but her death anniversary just passed. She was a Black single mom. You know what I mean? She wrote in the mornings when she could, and she was very clear. There's this great essay by Jen Baker in Electric Literature about how Toni Morrison didn't define herself by her work, and that to her was like very freeing. Like, if Toni Morrison can't figure this out, like, how can the rest of us figure? Like, Toni Morrison is Toni Morrison. You know what I mean? So yeah, so I feel like if writers start telling the truth, I think most people don't write every day. I just don't think it's possible,
I know a few people, but yeah.
I mean, pre-kids and pre-COVID, I may have been that person, but not right now.
So we have a question about poetry, and I'm not sure you'll have an answer, but I'll throw it out there. What advice would you give to someone who writes poetry? Are people interested in publishing poems? And I can hit on this too if you don't have an immediate answer.
Well, I can tell you, I have some very good friends who have written poetry. And as far as I understand, it's difficult because I think you have to win a prize to get published, right? Is that right, Zach?
Not exclusively, but that is one of the main paths for publishing poetry, publishing collections of poetry, I should say. Yeah. There are also, I mean, we mentioned that earlier on, I mentioned that we published Poet Lore, the America's oldest poetry magazine. So there are hundreds of literary journals that publish individual or a handful of poems from poets. If you're looking for a book, the book publication process for poetry is absolutely nothing like the book publication process for getting a novel published through a traditional, especially a major publisher like Algonquin. My first story collection, though, short story collections are somewhat can be similar to poetry. My first book was a story collection. It was actually published by Boa Editions, which is a legendary poetry press primarily. And about 10, 15 years ago now, they started doing fiction, short fiction collections as well. So I don't think we can go all the way into that. It's a little off the topic of the chat, but in short, it's a very different process. There are plenty of places to publish poetry, though.
I wish I could write poetry. I love poetry. I read it constantly, but.
Yeah. All right, let me glance back at my list for a minute. I think I've covered all the questions that were written so far. So you mentioned this a little bit, and I'm gonna go bring it up, was the structure of the novel. Now that you've explained it, I understand it was originally stories, but I was reading it as almost like the novel was a stem with the leaves of stories growing off of it. So that said, in reading the novel and not knowing that in advance, it didn't actually read to me like an adapted story collection. So good editing.
Thank you. Yeah. That's a big compliment to me and my editor, who was really great.
And so you've talked about how that structure evolved, just practically turning something into, but how do you have any like craft kind of advice on how you balance these self-contained units, because the stories all resonate so well alone. like they have they build to wonderful moments. So many great last lines or great last
Thank you.
actions. How do you balance the self-containedness of each little story with the forward motion, which is sustained throughout?
Well, I think as a writer and as a human, I'm just very interested in characters, and I'm very interested in people's motivations, and I'm interested in, I think I'm interested in empathy and like understanding why people come from the place that they come from. And so when I write stories, I try and put characters in positions that I may not fully understand and try to get to some kind of understanding. So I mean, probably the clearest example of this in the collection is, in the book is the story of Deepa. So Deepa is visually impaired. She's one of the characters, and her mother pulls her out of school, even though she's the smartest kid in the class. And this was actually inspired by a child that I met at an Anganwadi where I was doing research, who was visually impaired and was the top kid in her class, and whose parents ended up putting her in a residential school at the age of 5 and letting her study. So I was trying to understand why a mother would pull their kid out of school. And so that story sort of became about like what it means to protect your child, what it means to try and make the best choice for your child when you really don't have a lot of choices. So I think when I was thinking about the characters and the stories, I was really trying to understand why people came from where they came from. I was also trying to sort of process the setting I was in, because I was meeting so many people who were so similar to me but had such a different set of choices, you know, than I had growing up. And it felt so arbitrary to me that that was the case because, you know, like I said, my mom was born, my husband even was born several miles away from these communities. And my husband actually grew up poor. He grew up in a village, and yet, you know, he lives in like a house with me in Denver with like our adopted child. So I sort of fill out stories by trying to figure out where characters came from and try to explain why they act the way they do. And I like it when people surprise you. So I try and include some kind of surprise with a character whenever I write. But I think I'm also the kind of writer who doesn't like, so in writing there's like these two categories I recently learned about. There's like pantsers and plotters like plan out their whole book, and pantsers like fly by the seat of their pants. And I'm definitely a pantser. Like I have to write and then kind of figure out the world and the characters. So I often just have to be patient and sit with a story until it surprises me and until I can figure out where the character needs to go and where it needs to be. And I know that's a very unsatisfying question for like a craft talk, but I've met other writers who are the same way. We just kind of meet a character and then write them as truthfully as possible and then watch kind of where they go until it's a satisfying conclusion.
If I knew where a character was going, I wouldn't want to write them. That's like, I want to be a reader to the character as I'm writing it anyway.
Yeah, but I think at some point I stop pantsing and I'm like, oh, this is where the story is going. I think most writers at some point you have to have some structure, right?
Yeah. So what makes a scene worth writing? What made all these, I mentioned the stories all resonated with what makes resonance? Why is a particular scene worth telling? Because you had such great individual moments in all these stories, and I want to know your secret.
Thank you. That's really nice of you to say. Again, I think this is going to be an unsatisfying answer, but I just write until I surprise myself, basically. So I just keep going until I come to some kind of twist or some kind of ending that makes logical sense, but is also not expected. In this book also, I think some of the scenes that were the most resonant were ones that I encountered in my research that surprised me and that I processed by writing them. So there's several scenes in the book, like there's a scene where there's a child who climbs, one of the main characters, Padma, she climbs a tree in a rich neighborhood and plucks all these flowers to take for puja. And there was a girl who used to visit me in my Bangalore apartment every day at 5 and would climb her tree and gather flowers for puja. And I couldn't speak to her because it was right when we moved there, so I hadn't started learning Kannada yet, and she didn't speak any other Indian languages that I spoke. So my husband would sometimes translate for us, but I never really knew her motivation, right? And so I was trying to think like, what would make a girl take that risk? And she was like totally at war with it. It's basically very similar to the story. She was at war with my landlady who lived downstairs, who thought that this girl should not be plucking flowers. So she would like wait till my landlady was gone, climb up the tree, and then I would help her, and I would like keep lookout for her, and we had this like whole thing going. And then, as poor people do in India, she disappeared. I think her family were migrant workers, and they moved on. So when moments in my life resonate, one of the ways that I try and process them often is through fiction.
Well, I think that's a decent stopping point right there. You said you didn't have a concrete answer, but I feel like the concrete answer might have been write until you surprise yourself. And that's kind of like that's a really good piece of writing advice. I think that I've never heard it quite stated in a single sentence, but I think you said it in there. So
thank you.
I'm taking that advice. I'm going to try it next time I go with it. But
sometimes takes a while, but.
Oh, Mathu, thank you so much for joining me. This has been great. Thank you for writing this book. I am eagerly anticipating the next one, so no pressure, but come on.
Please send me childcare and I'll get the next one done, guaranteed.
Everyone, we're going to put up a link to donate for childcare. No. Also, going back to the poetry question real quick, Emily did post a link for some resources for finding literary journals to submit to. So please look at that link. And please, please, please buy A People's History of Heaven. It is my highest recommendation. We've just ordered or posted the link again to get that book from our friends at East City Bookshop or from your own local independent bookseller. Thank you so much. That's us. Go to writer.org to see what else we have coming up. And thank you for joining us, Mathu.
Thank you. And I see like a bunch of my students from my online classes and Zoom classes. Thank you guys so much for coming. I hope that I can't see all of your faces, but I hope at some point I will get to meet you in person.